very much. I suggested to you earlier that this was a broad coalition of left and right and Democrat and Republican. Indeed, in this town, there is another component of any coalition, and that is the professional government itself. Those who do not have partisanship but just have commitment to public service. And sometimes when I read in the press about the debate about the MEK or Camp Ashraf, I wonder, why are those who are reading the stories, rather than engaging in the debate of speculation, not quoting those who actually know? I'm very proud now to introduce to you, and I want you to listen carefully to these credentials. John Sano spent 28 years in the CIA and was appointed to the National Clandestine Services, formerly Director of Operations. He came to this position after having served as the Chief of East Asian Division of the Director of Operations. As Deputy Director, Mr. Sano chaired the NCS's senior leadership team and oversaw day-to-day management of clandestine services. In addition, he was an active member of the CIA's executive management team and regularly briefed senior administration and congressional officials on matters of national security and covert operations. He also previously served as a chief of station in 2 foreign and 1 domestic locations. You can discount the partisanship of some of us who may have motivations which I believe are only the national interest. But today, and in the weeks that have passed, you will hear again and again the most distinguished names in American national security and diplomacy and military affairs who have a remarkably similar view about the MEK, the mullahs and their regime, Camp Ashraf, and the delisting from the Foreign Terrorist Organization. I'm proud now to present another one of those distinguished voices. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here, although it's a little bit humbling, particularly in the presence of such luminaries as are sitting on the panel here. Just by a little bit of background, you may recall the State of the Union speech given by President Bush back in January of 2002, where he described the axis of evil: Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. In the intelligence community, we refer to those 3 countries and a few others as hard targets, and that includes Russia, China, a few other locations, maybe Libya. But in the axis of evil, in the intelligence community, that means as a hard target, you're the most impenetrable, the most difficult to access, the most hard to decipher, the most difficult to actually get to acquire information on. So we expend a tremendous amount of our budget, a lot of our manpower and resources dedicated to cracking that. The general perception has always been, particularly on the axis of evil, and I've worked against intelligence operations against each of those countries, you make the assumption that the people and the regime and the leadership are one and the same. It was very unique in the sense that when we, in the intelligence community, not just CIA, that when we talked about Iran, there was a difference. And it had to do with the people of Iran. There was an affinity that the people of Iran did not, and this is not just recently, this goes back years and years, that the people of Iran did not agree with the leadership, did not see themselves in that same light. And it was almost unique in terms of that affinity that intelligence operatives and analysts had for the people of Iran. And I think given events over the past few years, and when you look at an organization like the MEK, you look at the trials and tribulations of what's occurring in Ashraf, and that bears witness to the fact that it is unique. Now, all peoples can be considered the same. All peoples desire freedom, freedom from oppression, freedom from torture. But when you compare it to a country like North Korea, where the people have been systematically brainwashed and have given up the will to survive in a democratic society, those same atrocities that have been applied to the people of Iran have not taken the same tolls. So again, there's the difference. Now, as the good senator briefly stated in his introduction, I was a spy for nearly 30 years, spending the majority of that time overseas, operating in foreign countries for the United States. And during that time, I came into contact with more than a few number of fellow operatives or spies from other countries, the majority of whom were from nations that did not necessarily share America's goals, ideals, or strategies. Now, these foreign intelligence agencies have the authority to operate with near complete impunity in their own countries and across the globe. Not like the intelligence community in the United States, where there is a tremendous amount of oversight and regulations, laws that have to be maintained and protected. So, in essence, these other foreign entities can serve, both in their own countries and internationally, as powerful and secret weapons for their own leadership. And nowhere was this more evident than the case of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence and Security, the MOIS. Now, I've had personal contact with MOIS field operatives in my career overseas. But in the case of the MOIS, they operate, obviously, throughout Iran, as well as across the globe. They target dissidents, or anyone whom they believe, or they've been told, are potential threats to the regime. Their activities are not limited to intimidation, assassination, and torture. And while these are certainly the most egregious of their actions, they also engage in more subtle activities which have equally damaging political consequences. On the political front, these activities are designed to present to the world a different face of Iran, to depict those that stand up for democracy, for basic human rights, such as freedoms of expression and association, to be free from arbitrary arrest and detention, as well as torture. The MOIS will depict these people as subversives, as terrorists. Now, this is done in a rather futile attempt to shape world opinion, make it beneficial to their own cause and their ideals. Now, that's failing, obviously. It then becomes an effort, at a minimum, to get the world to turn a blind eye towards their regime's atrocities. And they don't just do that in the region or in their own country. They do it across the globe. They have far-reaching efforts. The situation in Camp Ashraf and the recent massacre which occurred there only 3 months ago is a perfect example in terms of what the MOIS is able to do in attempting to shape world opinion. It's been their consistent maligning of the MEK as a subversive and terrorist organization. This in direct contravention to the multiple reports, both here in the United States and internationally, that have provided the true story behind the massacre which occurred, and the reality of the MEK as a peace-loving, pro-democratic, non-violent organization seeking only to promote a pluralist system with freedom of speech, assembly, and political parties, a separation of church and state, and gender equality. While the Iranian regime would like us to believe that the massacre was in fact provoked, or that it did not even occur, both the UN High Commission for Human Rights, as well as the Spanish National Court, as well as Congress, other international organizations know the truth. They've condemned the massacre, calling for both international as well as Iraqi investigations and for greater protections for the residents of Camp Ashraf, as stipulated in the Multinational Force Iraq Agreement of July 2004, also in Article 45 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which recognizes the residents of Ashraf as protected persons and is called for recently in the House Resolution 332. In his annual report to the UN Security Council just a week ago, Secretary General Ban Ki-moon called for respecting the human rights of Ashraf residents and urged for a consensus solution to the situation. In addition, as has been pointed out previously, the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee unanimously approved an amendment to the Foreign Relations Authorization Act that makes it a policy of the U.S. to, quote, take all necessary and appropriate steps to prevent the forcible relocation of Camp Ashraf residents inside Iraq and facilitate the robust presence of the UN assistance mission in Iraq in Camp Ashraf. The residents of Camp Ashraf have called this their home for over 25 years. But still, they're being massacred, they're being abused, they're being denied their basic human rights. Iraq has called for the forcible dispersal of the residents of Camp Ashraf. Now, one can only imagine what would happen to them if they were forcibly moved to a remote location in Iraq away from the international community's watchful eyes. Recent comments by the U.S. ambassador in Iraq appear to endorse this proposal for some inexplicable reason. Perhaps it was the result of the Iraqi president Talabani's recent visit to Iran, and when he returned, made a report on Camp Ashraf to the U.S. Embassy from none other than the Iranian regime's supreme leader. While the international community has called for a humanitarian and consensus solution to the plight of the residents of Camp Ashraf, the current U.S. position in Iraq neither observes the residents' rights nor does it provide a consensus solution. In fact, it is the opposite. HR Resolution 332 urges the President of the United States to, again, quote, take all necessary and appropriate steps to prevent a forced relocation of Camp Ashraf residents either within or outside of Iraq in violation of the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law. In addition, the European Parliament, the United Nations, and prominent independent Iraq officials, as well as residents of the camp itself, have all vehemently rejected forcible displacement. The only exceptions are Tehran, a complicit Baghdad, and what appears to be, unfortunately, the U.S. Department of State. As the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Hugh Shelton, has stated, this is a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for ethnic cleansing, far outside the reaches now of the international community. Abandoning Ashraf is tantamount to giving the Iranian regime an incredibly stronger hand in Iraq. Instead of aligning with the Iranian regime's demands, we should be calling for a robust presence of U.S. assistance mission in Iraq monitoring teams to be placed in the camp to protect the residents against further massacres. And as the House Foreign Affairs Committee has stipulated, the U.S. should endorse the European Parliament's proposal to relocate the residents to third countries after negotiations are conducted on the condition that the situation in the camp would be normalized first. This is the only plan that both respects Iraq's sovereignty while ensuring that the human rights of Ashraf residents are protected. Now, Tehran obviously views the presence of the MEK in Iraq as a threat, a very large threat. And hence it's no surprise that the regime not only publicly supports the idea of displacement within Iraq, but actively lobbies for it in Baghdad and elsewhere. Much of this so-called lobbying is orchestrated by the MOIS through provisions of misleading, actually completely erroneous information. Disinformation, as we use in the spy world. Disinformation campaigns basically are feeble attempts to convince the United States and its organizations, the State Department, even Congress, as well as international observers that the residents of Ashraf should be displaced, and further, that the MEK should remain on the foreign terrorist organization list. Now, I've looked at some of the reporting that was provided to the Department of State, much of it redacted, some of it previously classified. And in looking through that, you have to look towards almost the fine print. Now, I was in the intelligence business for almost 30 years. And when you get a report, the first thing a policymaker should do is to determine the veracity and the accuracy of the source. The veracity of the source and the accuracy of the information. In looking through these reports, every single one that I reviewed said that either the source was unable to be recontacted or the information could not be verified. So basically what you're getting is rumor, speculation, with obviously a political motive. For an intelligence organization to be able to effectively promote a misinformation campaign, they have to have a couple of things at their disposal. They have to know the environment. Now, that's easy for the MOIS. It's their backyard. They have to understand who their adversaries are. In this case, it's the MEK, it's the United States, It's international observers. They have to be able to exploit those vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities are, as we've seen in the press, because this is an open society, a debate over America's continued military presence in the region, specifically as to what's happened in Iraq, the threat from Iran, a range of issues. So what the MOIS will do is fabricate information, use sources, we call them social and media contacts, and these are either recruited people or people that they've just contacted once or twice. They propagate orchestrated pieces of information that promote their own views. As an example, you've all probably seen the erroneous stories which have circulated in the press and are still circulating, stating that the MEK harbors terrorist groups, train women as suicide bombers, responsible for plane hijackings, bomb threats. While the MOIS has considerable skills in these areas of espionage, it cannot hide the truth that the MEK promotes a peaceful, nonviolent, and democratic Iran, are committed to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as international conventions and covenants, and promotes a domestic and foreign policy based on peaceful coexistence. The time is long past for the MEK to be listed from the Foreign Terrorist Organizations list. It was the MEK that provided incredibly useful information to the intelligence community on the Iranian nuclear threat. And as Ambassador Bolton pointed out, this corroborated a lot of other information that we had, and in some instances provided us with information that we had not previously heard. So as I said, it's a long time in coming. There is no, at least in my opinion, based on 30 years of service, there is no legitimate reason based on intelligence, either assessments or on collected information, which would continue the propagation of MEK on the foreign terrorist organizations networks. The time is long past. It needs to be corrected for whatever reason, but it needs to be done now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Although